Hello everybody, I'm here today with the wonderful Esther Freud, who has written this amazing book about 3 generations of women called I Couldn't Love You More. And it was such a deep and fascinating read and opened so many doorways for me, thinking about what has happened in life, what women have been through and continue to go through. And she writes beautifully in kind of painterly, illustratively, with really taking you into these lives and the unsaid pieces and the lack of communication and the secrecy and how people managed relationships different ways, and what happened to women in Ireland with mother and baby homes, which is really, really devastating and shocking. So yeah, it's a really beautiful read, and she's a really wonderful in-depth person to talk to and listen to. Her first book, Hideous Kinky, was made into a film with Kate Winslet, and she's written 9 novels, and she's just a really fascinating, in-depth person, wonderful to spend time with and share her happiness with. So thank you, Esther. Here's the interview. So, thank you very much, Esther, for coming to talk with me today. It's a great honor. I'm totally thrilled, and I love your book. I couldn't love you more. Of course, because it speaks to relationship, love, expectation, managing, desperation, fear, hopelessness, and the wonderful way you mixed and matched these different generations of women. And it's a very, very deep, moving book, isn't it? I mean, I imagine that was enormous to write.
Yes, I mean, I didn't expect that. I often realize that I've leapt into a project, almost always, because it's actually the only way to do it without knowing what you're really getting into. I think if you really knew what it would encompass, you may stop and hesitate, or maybe even never do it at all. So I'm a great believer in not thinking too much and just sort of starting and seeing where the story leads you. And my inspiration for the story was really to write about love. So I started in a rather kind of free and joyful manner, writing these short scenes of different women from different generations at different stages of the relationship, very playfully, sort of writing about first meetings and maybe misconceptions, misunderstandings. And as it continued, I started to really think, where's the plot? How's this going to hang together? What's going to happen? And then when I really thought about my mother, and because for the sort of sake of chronology, I took a woman in my own generational story, someone of my mother's generation, and someone of my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother. And that was great fun for quite a while. I had about 50 very playful, sort of enigmatic, atmospheric pages I was pleased with. Almost none of them survived into the final draft because I realized that I actually wanted to then write about secrets and about miscommunication and about kind of the pain of loss. And my idea about writing about love, which was really, I had conceived it as writing about the relationships between romantic relationships from the points of view of women. I realized ultimately I was writing about love between mothers and daughters. So that's what led me into what became quite a harrowing story to write at times.
Yeah, it was so huge. And I have to say, to read it was a ginormous experience, because it takes the reader into, I'm a similar age to you, it took me into my grandmother, how she'd had a very bossy husband, very, argumentative, and she was just going to stay married. That was it. And then my mother's generation, and that was all very rock and roll and hanging out in Chelsea and King's Road. And I loved your vignettes of, that my father worked on the Express, and he was Express journalist, and so you had all this at Fleet Street and Soho and Chelsea, and you know, going to France on a date, you know, and eating. It just was so evocative. And I did wonder, obviously you live in London, so you know these places, but did you go and immerse yourself in, you know, the French pub and the colony? And did you go, and I mean, maybe you go there anyway, but did you go and hang out in all these places writing it?
Gosh, did I? So often I imagined I would, but whether I really did or not, I think I just dug deep into memories and imagination. I used to go to the French pub quite a lot when I first moved to London, but that's a long time ago. And I think I did go back there once during the course of writing the book, and just sort of stood there and remembered how the doors flapped back and forth, etc. How small the place is, how you walk in and you're right up against the bar. But I'm not sure if I did or whether I just put myself there in my head. I'm not a great one for leaving my study when I'm writing. I have this idea that I will go and do research, but I have to be forced into an absolute dark corner of despair in terms of I can't think of anything else to write before I'll go off and do research, because I like to try and have it already. And then when I do the research, it gives me so much. I'm like, why did I hesitate? The Express, there's a scene where the character of Rosaline, who's the sort of, in some ways, I feel very central to the book. All the three women are equally as important, but she's a sort of crux of the story. She gets a job as a girl working in the post room at the Express, but she tells her parents that she's got a job on the news desk as a journalist. And I did quite a lot of research into what that would have been like, and that was great fun. And then, rather amazingly, I found a short story that my mother had written, which I'd never seen before. And it was about, she'd never mentioned this episode in her life. I assume it's based on some kind of truth. And it was about living very, very cheaply in a house in Chelsea that was owned by a man who was a musician. And he let young girls, young women stay for very little rent in his house, just to be surrounded by youth and beauty. And it was a very interesting and funny story. And I thought, I've just got to find a way to use it. It comes very late on in the book. I couldn't imagine when I first read it how I would slot it in. But then suddenly there was an opportunity for Rosaline to live this life for a little bit. And so I took the essence of that story and put it in. It's sort of almost like a short story in the book, chapter on its own.
I loved that. I grew up and went to school around Chelsea and South Kensington, and there's a bohemian part, strong, less so maybe now, but there was a friend of mine lived with a man hugely older than her in South Kensington, but it was this incredibly romantic experience of books and things. And when you wrote about Chelsea and the sensuality of it, and I loved all the way through, there's a lot of sex, which was lovely. Actually, it was like you were painting paintings all the way through, and sex was part of it. And that, you know, Rosaline wanted to be it was sexy, and it was, yeah, that weird, strange bohemian Chelsea thing, which really existed. A lot of those strange kind of houses and people and environments. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yes, it's funny. I don't, in my mind, I'm not sort of aware that there is so much sex. So I'm just something making a noise on my other computer. In my mind, I'm not so aware that there was so much sex in the book. Usually less is more, in my opinion. But I think because Rosaline particularly, but all the characters have sex. It's a whole life story for for the women, and not Kate so much, who's the youngest one. We really just follow her story for a few months, but we go back and forth within her history. But yes, sex had to come into it. It was impossible for that not to be part of the book, because it's so vital and so disregarded sometimes as being so important, especially in the background, because they're brought up, all three women, in the Catholic faith, and so the idea of sex being something that you really need and yearn for out of marriage is obviously very taboo.
Well, that was so interesting because the way, especially Rosaline, the way you created that relationship with Felix was so exciting. I mean, you gave wonderful context. You know, she'd come from this kind of restricted, bossy father, Catholic, Irish background. And so just meeting him and exploring things, the way you painted that was all of it was sensuous and sensual and freeing. And yet this freedom came with like such horror of being on your own as a woman, and then what then happens to her story, and that kind of juxtaposition of innocence, you know.
I know. It's so sad that it has to come at such a price.
Yeah.
But I think for so many women of that generation who'd been born during the war, grew up sort of under the, you know, the fallout from the war, rationing and fear and the trauma that had happened. And then they came into the late 50s, early 60s, and the whole world exploded in color. And it's just a marvelous, liberating time. And because there are quite sad and difficult themes in the book, I wanted it to be predicated on real love and passion and a feeling that someone had opened up the world for Rosalie in any way, and that love, however difficult it might become in people's lives, it almost always starts in a completely marvelous way. So I wanted to underpin the relationships, all three of them, with that. And even Aoife, the grandmother, mother, and wife as she is, actually one of her first scenes is her wedding weekend and her honeymoon in the hotel on the Strand, and how happy she is.
Yeah, that came all the way through, this sweetness and this hope. Even, you know, with Rosaline, like looking at that myself from this modern lens, would be like she turns up somewhere and she's not welcome, or then she still had this in love feeling, this massive in love feeling. And it made me curious. And sorry, going round the houses, because I know you draw on your own history, if that's all right, Esther.
Yes.
But I found out your parents died at a similar time.
Yes, that's right.
And
it's connected them very much in my mind. Maybe I thought about that when I was writing the book. They had been friendly all their lives, but they hadn't been together since I was very little. But then when they got ill and died in the same week, as it turned out, it seemed to connect them very viscerally and sort of somehow brought her right into the forefront of his life. It was a strange thing that happened.
Was he the love of her life?
I don't know if she would have expressed it like that, but she didn't regret it.
Yeah.
And it was a life-changing relationship. And just because she was young didn't make it less meaningful.
Yeah.
That I remember talking to her about whether she had been shocked to find that she was pregnant when she was 18, unmarried, with a man 20 years older. And she said, no, I always wanted to have children and I was madly in love and I assumed, well, I suppose I'll have a baby. And I did, and I couldn't have been more delighted. So that's how she felt about it. I don't think she felt regretful. And I think she wasn't, it's interesting in love because it's easy to look back and undermine something because it then became difficult and caused pain. But she didn't do that.
No.
She held it in its place as it was for her years before, however difficult it may have been. And I admired that. And I we can all learn from that.
Beautiful. It's beautiful. Something quite Irish in a weird way, actually. I feel I have Irish relatives, and there's something quite Irish to me sometimes about adding this sweetness, in a way, to a story. My mother-in-law is Irish and her husband's died this year, and there's something, he was the dream man. Now, there wouldn't have been all the dream man, the whole, but she tells more and more dream stories about, which are true as well. All of it's true, but it's kind of this sweetness of that. Yeah, the sweetness of the love. Yeah.
It's lovely. And I felt when I thought about my grandparents, who were, as you described, your grandmother, very much married for life.
Yeah.
And the way generational relationships have changed. So for that generation, they were married, just as the war began. And it was very much that you put your husband first, and that the children would come and they would go. Whereas then, in the middle, the generation of our mothers, in a way, it was self-exploration and self-development and freedom, and sort of looking at the world as a human individual person, not just as an appendage to someone. And then my generation, I feel, has gone very much focused on your children, and that the husband may come and go, but the children are really there for life. So I really was very interested, and I spent a lot of time thinking about that and weaving that idea into the three storylines and playing with it. So for Aoife, even though her husband in sometimes is a real bully and a brute, she is utterly dedicated to him and loves him as her. And some of the ways that he behaves that aren't, we look on harshly, he does that in order to protect his wife from shame or hurt. And that's something that's hard to sort of understand at the time, but you can look back on that and see people's motives for doing things very, very different.
Makes total sense. It makes total sense. I really get that now. My grandfather was Irish Indian, and grandmother Welsh, and he was, really dominant. But I now think, he was Irish Indian in Wales, right? Wanted to make sure everybody was going to be okay and survive, right? It's a lot. So there's a kind of protective patriarchal thing, and underneath that would have been deep care. So I really, I understand that. And then it makes sense, doesn't it, that Rosaline would have sought freedom.
Rebel from all of that and all the strictures of discipline in the church, discipline in her schooling, discipline in the marriage, in the family. She just was enough of it, and wanted to find her own way, which she was a very independent and courageous person her whole life, my own mother. So I sort of was able to write Rosaline, even though I started out using some of my mother's sort of early life and her background, but then very quickly their stories diverge entirely. And Rosaline's story was very much to do with what to do when you find yourself alone and pregnant, and to have an abortion is illegal. The fear that if you go to go to your family or the church for help, which are the only places you really can go, that your baby will be taken away, that you'll be shut up in a home. And, it's interesting, at the time that the book was coming out, about a year or so ago in 2021, there's so much in the press about Irish Catholic mother and baby homes, but also English mother and baby homes, non-religious mother and baby homes. And the fact that at that time in the late 50s, early 60s, if you went into hospital in London unmarried, it was assumed that this baby was not really yours to keep. That often there's not even a question that you would be allowed to take this baby home. The baby would be taken off and put into a home, and you would be sort of sent on your way to start again. And my mother's oldest friend, they met when they were both teenage, pregnant, unmarried mothers. She was, as one of the women I'm just describing, not from a Catholic family. And she said she was the only young girl unmarried in the ward where she had her baby who had even considered that they could keep it. And she kept her baby, who's my oldest friend. And she said she was only able to do that because her father supported her, but no one else had that support. And I read some harrowing books of young women whose parents, they just sent them away. They were so terrified of the shame of anyone in the neighborhood knowing, anyone even in the family, and the sheer terror that they also would be ostracized and blamed and looked down on. So in a way, I follow that story, and Rosaline finds herself in an untenable situation, and she goes for help and finds herself caught up in the mother and baby home. And I sent her back to Ireland because I wanted to sort of show just the sheer brutality of that particular regime, and I had done so much research on that. And I did leave home and go to Ireland twice and do research, which I couldn't have written the book without going to that particular mother and baby home just outside Cork, where I was assuming my mother would have gone to if she had found herself in that situation. And there it was, just the rows and rows of small windows going up and up, going back and back. And there's a little graveyard, a chapel. There was a lot of there was actually, how to describe this? There was a lot of controversy at the time I went back, because the chapel had been cordoned off and they had started to demolish it, the church, because no one knows where the babies who were born in this home, the thousands of babies who died there over the years that it existed as a mother and baby home. And the nuns who worked there would never say where the babies were buried. And then the church started to demolish the chapel. So who knows what they were hiding? But there was a small graveyard, and that was just for nuns. And they still don't know where the bodies were buried. And then women who gave birth there have erected their own little shrines with teddy bears and small pieces of written information on homemade crosses saying, I will always love you, ma'am, to babies, because so many babies did die in those homes because they were so maltreated and undernourished, and they often weren't allowed their mothers to be near them to feed them when they needed it. And it was pretty brutal. I mean, agonizingly brutal. And then the women were asked to forget it had ever happened and go back out into the world. And they were also asked, when they were in the homes, that they changed their name. So when they went out, they took up their old name and went off. And women were often able to bury it, but never forever. So they could manage for maybe 10 or 20, 30 years even, get married, have children, carry on. And there'd be a point for almost all of them where suddenly it broke open, it cracked. A bit like the wonderful film Philomena, where something happens and suddenly she just has to know what happened to her son.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Oh, Esther, what an extraordinary journey. What an unbelievable journey. And then, that synergy with your book coming out at the same time, all this stuff, like speaking to consciousness, really, like speaking to, you were like writing as this was about to burble open.
I know. It was an extraordinary thing. The government, the Irish government, had commissioned a report into mother and baby homes, which was published just a few months before my book came out. So it was absolutely everywhere. And I felt, it's so strange. I've been working on this book for about 5 years, and suddenly I didn't know they had also been working on this commission and this report. So that was a very interesting,
because just reading your book, it was so poetic and touching and deep. Also, like you've spoken to, secrets and lack of communication, with things being said through sensuality, image, metaphor, and words missing for people. And yet you said so much through your textures and through so much of how you textured. And I thought it's interesting because your father's perhaps the world, such a famous artist in terms of textures and revealing personal stuff, people he knew and his children, and through portraiture. And you are creating, these deep portraits with textures. And I wondered if you felt like a connection with your father. And
I mean, I don't know if it's so hard to know, because so many writers without that influence do extraordinary things with layers of visual texture, as you describe it, and sort of things being incredibly filmic or painterly. Yeah. So partly it's to do with concentrating very deeply on what you want to say and digging deeper. And I do often see things in scenes, and or sort of I'm following it almost as if it's unraveling. But I think that having watched my father work so often in my life, and seeing the patience and the kind of delicacy with which he builds something up, it's probably given me more faith that this will increase the sort of visibility and believability of my work. I mean, I was just reading a short story today that I read yesterday, thought, yeah, I think it's nearly there. Read today, changed things, took some things out. I'd changed yesterday, put some things back that I'd taken out, etc. On it went. And I thought, I'll just probably have to keep doing this until the story really works, and I'll know when it works. And I saw him do that. But then, of course, lots and lots of writers do that with incredible effect without that influence. But certainly it did help me to have patience and to have faith that if you just keep on working at something, it will get better.
And I suppose also he drew people he knew, his children, and he's done work of you, very powerful portraits of you. So, and you've spoken about drawing on your life and people so there's a kind of something around, isn't it? There's some mirroring in a way of kind of.
Yes, I mean, some people feel it's cheating, or they feel very superstitious or complicated about being open about the fact that they draw on people that they know. They're inspired by their own stories. They're maybe using things that maybe don't belong to them, belong to somebody else in the family. And it's a big issue for writers, how autobiographical one should be. One should allow yourself to be, or even admit to being. Because my father was quite supportive when he read my first two books, which are quite autobiographical. He kind of, his main ambition for me was that the book should be good. What subject I'm really taking, what I'm working with, that's really up to me, as it was up to him. And so he wanted to talk about things that he liked in the books, things that worked. The fact that they were recognizable was really neither here nor there, because in the end, I created it as fiction, and most people, 99.9%, would read it without knowing whether I really did have that dog, or whether, my half-sister was late, etc. It doesn't really matter. It's whether it hits home, whether it's believable, whether it's poignant and moving at the right moments.
That's so fantastic to have that kind of support from him, right? That's the measure, because what about your mum? How did she feel about being portrayed?
My mother actually had a very similar attitude. Her heart was open to me creating something. I mean, I think it wasn't that easy for her, but she was bigger than her squeamishness.
That is so awesome, Esther, because I've heard you speak that most people don't write because they're frightened of upsetting their parents, and they're frightened of the discipline, which was just two wonderful things to give to people. Thank you so much. And I just thought, but how do you get over that? How do you get over upsetting your family and the discipline? How do you get over that? And I have heard you speak that it's delicate. It's a delicate piece. So yeah, how do you manage?
I think the two things
sound like
combined, actually.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that the two, I sort of really pinpointed the two things that stop people writing, being usually, what does your mother think, and just having the discipline. But I found that probably the two things go hand in hand, that if you can sit down and just write and try and put from your mind other people's opinions and criticisms of you, and the sort of person or whoever it is who happens to be sitting on your shoulder, that little voice of doubt that's never, everybody has it. If you can just put all that from your mind and just decide, I'm going to just write whatever it is I need to say, I'll worry about it all later, I think you can make headway. And I suppose what I did feel was that both my parents were rebellious. They didn't try and please their families their whole lives. And I am not a very rebellious person. And I have always tried to please my family because I want to, because I absolutely adored them and wanted to be close. I didn't want estrangement. And then, through some kind of inherent need, I sat down and risked pleasing, not being the good daughter. And I just wrote what I needed to write. And I think that there was some aspect of them that probably thought, good for her. Wow, turns out she's got a bit more fight than we thought. Because you know your children. And of course, now my children are, my oldest son is the age I was when I started writing. And I think, yeah, you know, when you have a very good child, you kind of admire it when they just go, I'm actually going to do whatever it is I want. So I felt that it was sort of everything twisted and turned around a bit. And I wouldn't say I understood all that at the time. I was only about 27, but I think I understood some element of it. And there was a bit of me that thought, you can't just do whatever you want, and then I should just be so good my whole life. I'll just do whatever I want. You've shown me the way.
So in a way, you had the perfect models.
I did.
Right, in both parents. And your mother must have been pretty extraordinary. Must have been.
She was. I mean, oddly enough, my parents had a lot in common. Neither of them were sentimental. So they didn't want to be close, you know, as I've said, to their brothers and sisters and parents and uncles and aunts. They were just fiercely themselves. And so my mother was quite freed and liberated by that. You know, she, as you know, people know who know my work, she took us off to Morocco when we were very little, and she was very young. She was only, well, I was 4, so she was 24. Off we went. She traveled quite a lot in her life. When she turned 60, she decided that she'd been learning Spanish, that she decided she would go to Mexico and work in the Cloud Atlas Mountains in an orchid nursery. And she wrote a book which she self-published called Garden of the Jaguar, about her sort of adventures. And she was just an amazing person and very inspiring and very creative. She made lots of things beautiful and creative. She was an incredible gardener, but she made her home very beautiful. She cooked in an interesting way. She gave her attention to small things. And whereas my father, it was the bigger picture of his own work. He didn't have an awful lot of time or energy left over for other things, but they were both very visual and very creative.
Because I get the sense you were very close to him. And was he supportive then? Was he supportive to you all growing up, and to your mum? Was he a supportive?
Surprisingly, for the amount that he managed to pack in to his life, the incredible amounts of friendships, relationships, paintings, different families, it amazes me how much time he gave us. I grew up in Sussex with my sister and my mother, and until I was 16, he would visit sometimes, but mostly we came to London to see him. And then when I moved to London, age 16, then I started to sit for him. And then once I started to sit for him, that's a sort of twice weekly event in my life. So I would sit for two evenings a week. That I think I did that on and off then until I had my own children in my early 30s. I sat for him very regularly. And so I saw him all the time, and he was a great one for, I don't know how he honestly had time. A great one for making a phone call, chatting. He always liked to know absolutely everything that was going on. He was.
So you sound like you were very bonded with him, actually. Yeah. And was that a special, unique thing? Because he had quite a few children. Was that special to you? Was he quite good with lots of them, or?
He was remarkably good with lots of them. He had real charisma in terms of when he was focused on you, you felt as if it must just be you, but I know that it wasn't at all, that many of his children felt that way.
Yeah. So, and did you feel like a pressure, right? So Freud is obviously an extremely worldwide famous name for very good reasons. And it's so interesting, isn't it? You know, what's been brought into the world because of Sigmund Freud, and then there's so many elements to it. Did you feel pressure with that kind of background to do things and achieve things? And
I never did, because when I was growing up, I have to say, Sigmund Freud was never mentioned
Ah,
um, by either of my parents.
oh,
I could honestly say I got to 18 without having any idea who he was.
oh
So
my goodness.
I know, seems almost unbelievable. Maybe it's like it's such a big thing that no one remembers to mention it. I was saying I actually was commissioned recently to write something about this. So I was laughing, telling my children, and they were like, "Well, you never mentioned to us," and I was like, "Oh, maybe I don't. Maybe there's nothing to say." It's um, so that is quite interesting. And I, my first ambition was to be an actress, and as an actress, no one cares what you're called unless your name is Olivier or Redgrave. That would be useful, but no, it didn't make any difference at all, and I didn't feel any pressure in any kind. All I wanted was to have a life that my work was my passion, as because I saw how happy painting made my father, and I really wanted to find that. So I decided, age about 12, oh, I'm going to be an actress. Then I'll be happy. Whenever I get a job, I'll be doing my favorite thing, telling stories. And actually, it did make me very happy in some ways. But when I started writing, I realized now I'm happy. I didn't realize that acting made me really unhappy and happy, whereas writing mostly made me happy.
And that was an interesting thing. I saw that you said that, you may have had, excuse me if I'm not putting this well, but you may have had nerves, but once you started to write, that changed. If I'm hearing you right about that writing for you was this quite immersive journey and process, and that changed with your nerves. Am I following that from something?
Nerves, nerves about acting, or just being.
Live. I don't know. It was an interview. Maybe I might not have heard it exactly right, but something around when you got your rhythm with your writing, there was this immersion and flow, and you didn't have the same nerves around, I don't know, life or things. I don't know.
It definitely changed me. I think writing that first novel that had been sitting inside me, and I'd really kept it alive, it meant I was more focused and more present. I remember before then, I was quite a sort of dreamy person. I was quite caught up in my imagination. And when I wrote Hideous Kinky and it was out there, one, I didn't have to keep remembering this extraordinary adventure, and I felt much more present and much more kind of. It's like my eyes sprung open and I saw the world, and that had a good effect on me for sure. And I think that not having to keep going and presenting myself to be employed as an actress and being rejected or being accepted and having to prove that I was good by every single night on the stage, I think that was absolutely marvelous when I just released myself from that pressure. And I thought, how could I have even considered doing something like that? But it was just I realized I was living a life that suited me. So I think I just calmed right down and was much more content.
Yeah, no, it makes so much sense. And I'm just curious, actually. I'm sorry this is sideways, but the figure of Freya in the book, the daughter of Kate, is quite obsessed with death.
Yes.
I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I actually used that because one of my three children was really obsessed with death. And I had written a lot of things down that he, a little boy, in fact, had said. And I was just thinking what fun it would be to use those things that I'd written down. And so I gave that to Freya. Small children, actually, it is quite common that they're really interested in death. And some of them never think of it at all, but some of them, they can't let it go and
Yeah.
they turn it over for years and years. And you have to find a way to deal with it. So I didn't know. I was hoping that it would sort of become sort of fabulously apparent why Freya feels this way. But I think I just was giving her, she's just a thinking little person, and something else for Kate, her mother, to have to sort of manage in some way.
That was that was so interesting. There was a kind of like, different, like Aoife was very accepting,
Mm-hmm.
and Rosalind was, embracing this freedom and sensuality, but Kate seemed like she had to manage everything. And it was so
Yes.
interesting, these kind of also these different stages of relating and love. There was this, and for Kate, there was this, it was so interesting because they kept having sex. In my world, they kept having sex, but there was this managing all the time and lack of, even though she'd say we keep arguing, but there seemed to be a lack of communication in a way,
in Kate's relationship.
Kate's relationship.
Yeah. Well, Kate and her partner Matt, they have sex because it is their sticking plaster.
Right.
You've got to wonder if they didn't have sex, why they were together, because everything was so difficult between them.
Yeah.
But they had a connection. They had a physical connection that worked, and it soothed Kate and probably soothed him as well. And it meant they thought, yeah, it's fine, we can do this. And then the time would pass and the tensions would create it. So I was looking at all different ways that people are glued and connected together.
Yes,
their way, and that's very common.
That was very interesting because you could feel like I think you've spoken about, you could feel all the words all the way through with everybody, and you named so much that was going on, but actually the way the joins came were all different with all of them. And I wondered, after doing such a deep book and actually writing about, oh gosh, what happened to women and what can still happen to women in the world, what's been left for you about love or hope or expectation around relationships, love, and
what's left to write about in a sense,
or left for you after writing such a deep book. I notice if I talk to young women now in their early 20s, they're shocked about what things have been for women or the history for women. They can't fathom it. It's like a real mystery. And it was so interesting, you writing through the generations, and then made me curious what came out for you, because it was such a kind of stream through, and I wondered if it came to you about wanting something more with love, something. Yeah.
I think that I was feeling that when I began the book.
Right.
I was wanting something more from love, and I was really, really looking at love.
Yeah.
I think that by the time I finished it, I was kind of pretty much like over the whole idea of like wanting anything particular. I was just sort of happy to be living in my present. So I was much more concerned with it at the beginning, and that was my interest. And it took quite a long time, this book. And I'd sort of like, when you were asking, I was like, I can't even think what you're talking about. But of course, at the beginning, I was absolutely caught up with the subject and had been thinking about it hugely, writing notes, writing diary pieces about, how can love really work? What's a really satisfying relationship? Looking at different models, reading about people thinking, oh, they sound like they have a good marriage, or they seem very happy. Now they're divorced. Or I actually wrote a short story called The Love Detective about someone totally obsessing about all these subjects. So, but so that was one of my driving forces.
Yeah. And now, does that mean you're just much happier, or it got?
Yeah, I'm in a much more peaceful stage of life, in a much more peaceful relationship, where it's not sort of like galvanizing my thoughts in the way.
Yes, isn't that interesting? Yeah, it's because people talk about this thing called conscious uncoupling, about leaving something that doesn't feel right, but being open to something that feels more right, or feels more flowing, or that kind of.
It's only really the bad relationships that obsess you.
Yes,
you're in a good one, you don't have to think about it very much. It's just part of your lovely life, Right. So I have very few thoughts about it right now.
Yes, it makes sense. It does make so much sense. It does make so much sense. And what about your children? How do they feel about, your books, or writing about children in your books? Or do you know what I mean? How do they feel about?
Interestingly enough, they haven't. This was the first book that my youngest son, who's a pretty passionate reader, he read the book, and he was quite upset at just what women went through. He just had no idea. He was really taken aback. And then I think my older children were slightly surprised that, he's read it. So certainly my daughter, I'm not sure if my older son read it, but they don't, on the whole, they haven't read my books, is what I'm really trying to say in a rather long-winded way. But then that might change now as my younger son is showing the way.
Yeah. And do they ever feel like, oh gosh, are we in that book? Or they don't worry about any of that? No.
They seem totally uninterested, absolutely caught up in their own life, as they should be, and
Yeah,
No.
perfect. And how do you handle it if you have people who think it's them and they are a bit concerned it's them in the book?
Well, I try quite hard to disguise people if it feels as if it could be a sensitive area. But then the most surprising people think that it's them and are upset. So you feel that you've covered yourself so well. And I almost always worry. If I'm really worrying, I do sometimes check with the person and say, I'm really wanting to write about this, but is that too difficult? And if it is, I won't, or I'll find a way. But can I be quite honest with this particular theme? It's not usually them. It's usually something that's come up that they will recognize. And often people are like, go for it. That's so interesting. Do it. It's
Really?
fiction. No one will think it's me, you know.
And what about your Irish family? How did they feel about you writing about that history in Ireland? And
Well, it was interesting. I got closer to my Irish family because I went out and did a few research trips. So that was a real sort of upside. But then, and this has happened to me a few times. Nobody minds the books, but I have got so sort of carried away by being so immersed in the story that when I do the publicity, I probably have at times written pieces or talked too openly about connecting my own life to my story, probably even more than it is relevant, just because I've sort of almost lost my bearings.
Yeah.
And so I think that has been harder for my family going back over years than anything I actually write in fiction.
Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? That makes sense. So that people feel like you're then talking about something more than you might be, kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you sound like you've really managed this.
I think I've managed it quite well and occasionally not so well.
Yeah, but on the whole,
Sometimes I've fallen into a pit and then I've had to dig myself out because I do not want to lose any of the love I have in my life through, misunderstanding or misconception or hurt anybody. That's never my intention. So if I do find that I have done that, I do everything in my power to kind of make amends in some way.
yeah.
But it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one for all writers. You want to write something truthful, something that hits and bites and that makes sense and is relevant to other people without, exposing someone's pain if they're not up for that. You've got to really own it. You've got to really work it. Yeah.
Because it is deep. It is deep. What the stuff you write is deep and thought-provoking, which reminds me, I saw a wonderful interview at the Freud Museum with you and Philip Sands.
Oh, yes. Yes, in Vienna. We did this amazing event together.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
Where you found out, or he found out, that your great aunts and his grandparents were on the same train to going to their deaths.
Most extraordinary thing. So he'd done all this research and he discovered that his beloved grandfather's mother, who no one ever knew what happened to, had been in Vienna and had been taken to Theresienstadt. And he had looked through all the footage of the Nuremberg trials and he had discovered that it had been on the 23rd of September, 1942, that she had been taken to Treblinka, where she had perished. And he discovered this from tracking various things down through the incredible ability of everything to be documented by the Germans. But then, as he tracked through footage of the Nuremberg trials, he was watching an interview with one of the few people who survived Treblinka, and he described how on the 23rd of September 1942, he'd been standing on the station when Sigmund Freud's three sisters, women in their 80s, got off the train. And he then describes how they were not given any leniency. And Philippe Sands thinks, hang on, 23rd of September 1942, that is a familiar date. And so we discover, then he tracks and he finds the names of every single person who was on that train. And there is his great grandmother, and there are my great aunts. all together, possibly in the same carriage. There we are, we're friends anyway. We had no idea we had any connection apart from our families came from Vienna. And we were sitting there, I felt goosebumps rising up on my skin. And he said, isn't it extraordinary that we're sitting here next to each other? And I said, in a way, it's extraordinary that we haven't always known each other, that we would have known each other. Our families probably knew each other. There they were, living in the same little area in Vienna. So that was really, we had a very powerful, we wandered through the streets of Vienna talking about how we'd got to this particular place and how we'd become connected in this way. And yeah, it was pretty amazing.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It was extraordinary just witnessing you both sitting there and with all this information opening up and opening up and opening up, and you just kind of those crossovers are just
before Sigmund Freud and his wife and daughter and household left Vienna for the last time in 1938. They asked a wonderful photographer to come and take photographs of every room in the apartment. And they have these rooms in the completely empty Freud Museum in Vienna to show how it had been. Now it was a place of absence. But the man, one of the people in the audience at that talk, was the son of this photographer. And he tried to ask a question. He was completely overwhelmed with tears. It was just a very, very moving event.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. I know there was a woman who asked a question, and her great-grandfather had been removed from his office as a high up legal person, and it turned out her next door neighbor's great-grandfather was the person who did it, her good friend.
Isn't that an extraordinary story?
That was after the photographer in that interview. I was like, my God, we all meet over and over and over and over and over.
Yes.
And it's
I know. It's like you couldn't really make that up.
You couldn't make that up.
And sometimes you can't really use the truth because the coincidences are too unwieldy. And in fiction, you sometimes write, I said, sometimes you want to get to the truth and the honesty. And sometimes I think, okay, I'll just throw it in. And then you have to take it out because actually it's not really believable. So you have to find a line between whimsical and imaginative and completely honest, and find something that just works in fiction, that hits that spot, that might be neither of those things.
It's such a good point. My mum wrote erotic fiction in the 80s, that kind of Jackie Collins type thing. And she kept making up characters, and then they would literally be a real person. They kept having to rewrite characters and names because they'd written someone exactly without realizing. And it's amazing, isn't it? Like you said, sometimes it sounds so odd. You wouldn't believe it, would you? So it's an amazing thing. So Esther, what are you doing now? Obviously, you're always writing. You're always creating.
I'm always writing. I started writing some short stories because for the first time in 30 odd years of writing, I'd used up so many of the things that were interesting to me in the last novel with the sort of 3 storylines in this big book. For the first time, I didn't have a burning story to tell. So I started to write some short stories. And then I thought, well, if I write some more, I could put these all together. So I have written a collection of short stories. Didn't quite satisfy me. So now I'm rewriting them and weaving them together more as a sort of linked short story, possible novel in stories. I'm not sure, but I'm enjoying it much more now. I feel like I'm going somewhere slightly different with the themes, and it's great fun. I love rewriting and I love editing, so I'm quite happy at the moment. Just I've got all these stories, and I'm just sort of breathing an extra layer of life into them.
It's lovely. And are you teaching?
Yes, I'm teaching. I live in North London, and I teach somewhere local to me that I just set up a group. I've actually been teaching this group on and off for about 12 years, and some of the same people come every time. Sometimes there's new people. It's a very, very lovely group. We just do lots of creative writing exercises and to just look at all the different ways you can tell your story. And yeah, it's great fun.
Oh, it's so lovely. Well, thank you very, very much, Esther. So generous of you to give me your time and energy and space and share with me. And this is a wonderful book for people, you know. And it's so funny because you are actually in this lovely, very content, very relaxed place. But I think the book is a very powerful, moving read for whoever reads it. And I think it takes each person on a journey. So thank you for doing that and all that you're doing. It's fantastic.
It's a pleasure. It's lovely to talk to you. Thank you.
So that was the lovely Esther Freud. Thank you so much, Esther, for sharing your wisdom and your writing processing and your thoughts and ideas with me today. It was really enlightening and thought-provoking and kind of very helpful about how to look at love and relationships, and also writing, how to handle writing one story and turning that into fiction, and how to make that an art form, but also be aware of other people's needs and wants and how to keep them in mind. So thank you, Esther. That was absolutely beautiful and a great experience. Blessings to you and wishing you so much more success. Thanks.